The moment Gertrude Merritt walked into the Caldwell Creek Harvest Social on that warm October evening in 1882, every fiddle in the room seemed to play a little louder, every lantern a little brighter, as if the whole of southern Kansas had conspired to announce her arrival. She was 23 years old, with dark chestnut hair pinned up in the style her mother had taught her before fever took the woman away, and she wore a blue cotton dress that she had sewn herself over 3 late evenings by lamplight. She was not the wealthiest woman in Caldwell Creek. She was not the most fashionable, and she would have been the first to tell you so. But there was something about Gertrude Merritt that made a room feel more alive simply because she had entered it, a quality that had nothing to do with beauty and everything to do with the particular way she carried herself, as though she believed the world was worth engaging with fully every single day, regardless of what it had done to her the day before. And the world had done plenty. Her father, Harold Merritt, ran the only dry goods store on the main street of Caldwell Creek, a modest but respectable establishment that had survived the cattle drives and the droughts and the occasional outbreak of lawlessness that characterized frontier life along the Kishom Trail. Harold was a good man, but he was tired, and he had been tired for 10 years since the death of Gertrude's mother, and tired men sometimes made decisions from exhaustion rather than wisdom. He had recently taken on a business loan from a man named Cyrus Holt, who owned the Holt Land and Cattle Company, and who had been quietly buying up most of the county for the better part of 5 years. Gertrude knew the loan was a mistake. She had told her father so. He had smiled at her in that sad, distant way of his, and said she worried too much for a young woman who ought to be thinking about dancing and suitors. So she had come to the social. She had come because the whole town came, because October meant the harvest was in, and the cattle drives were done for the season, and people needed to breathe and laugh, and stamp their feet to music before the long gray quiet of winter settled over the plains. She had come because her friend Nora Whitfield had practically dragged her out of the store with both hands, saying that a woman who spent every Friday night doing inventory had already surrendered something essential about herself. And she had come, she supposed, because some stubborn, hopeful part of her still believed that an evening could be surprising. She was not wrong about that. The social was held in the Caldwell Creek Town Hall, which was also used as a schoolhouse during the week and a church on Sundays, because frontier towns were practical that way. The benches had been pushed to the walls, and someone had strung dried corn husks and orange ribbons from the rafters, and the Flannery brothers were up on the low stage with their fiddles going at a reel that made your feet move whether you wanted them to or not. There were probably 60 people in the room, ranchers and shopkeepers and their families, a few cowboys who had stayed on after the drives ended, and the usual assortment of townspeople who made up the social fabric of a place like Caldwell Creek. Gertrude found Nora immediately, because Nora was easy to find. She was already dancing with Thomas Reeves, a young man who worked at the livery stable and who had been trying to court Nora for the better part of a year with the patient determination of a man who knew what he wanted. Nora caught Gertrude's eye over Thomas's shoulder and mouthed something that looked like, "You look wonderful," and Gertrude smiled and found herself a spot near the refreshment table where a large bowl of apple cider punch sat next to a plate of molasses cookies. That was when she first noticed him. He was standing near the far wall, not quite in the corner but close to it, as though he had chosen a position that allowed him to see the whole room without being at the center of it. He was tall, probably 6 feet or close to it, with the kind of lean, weather-cut build that came from years of outdoor work rather than from any deliberate effort. His hair was dark brown and a little too long, curling slightly at his collar, and he had the kind of jaw and brow that suggested he had spent considerable time squinting into distances. He was wearing a clean shirt, dark trousers, and boots that had been polished but still showed the honest wear of use, and he held a cup of cider in one hand as though he had accepted it to be polite and then forgotten about it entirely. He was watching the dancers with an expression that Gertrude could not quite read from across the room. It was not boredom. It was not unhappiness. It was something more considered than either of those things, something that made him look as though he was turning something over very carefully in his mind. Every other man in the room who was not already dancing had, at some point in the first 20 minutes, made his way to the side where the unpartnered women sat or stood and asked one of them to dance. That was how these things worked. That was the social contract of a harvest gathering in a small Kansas town. You came, you danced, you talked, you ate molasses cookies, and if you were a man without a partner, you asked a woman to remedy the situation. It was not complicated. This man did not ask anyone. Gertrude noticed it first as a mild curiosity, then as something more pointed as the first reel ended, and a slower waltz began, and she watched 3 different men cross the room to ask 3 different women while he remained exactly where he was, watching, that same expression on his face, turning something over in his mind. James Hartley asked her to dance first, which she accepted because James was harmless and kind and a perfectly acceptable partner for a waltz, and while she danced, she found her eyes drifting back across the room to where the tall man still stood. He had not moved. He watched the dancers with what she now decided was a kind of concentrated attention, as though he was studying something he had not yet fully understood. After James, it was Walt Drummond, and after Walt, it was a young cowboy named Pete something, and in between she drank more cider and talked to Nora for a few minutes about nothing important, and all the while she kept noticing that the man near the far wall had still not asked anyone to dance. Not a single person. And he did not look as though he was too shy or too awkward. He simply looked as though he had decided not to. It nagged at her in a way she could not entirely explain. She had always been a woman who asked questions. Her mother had told her it was her best quality and her most exhausting one in equal measure, and her father had said it more than once that her curiosity was going to get her into trouble someday. But the way he said it always made it sound like he was secretly proud of her for it. She asked questions because silence around something obvious seemed to her like a small surrender, and she had been surrendering enough small things lately, to worry and exhaustion and the grinding reality of the store's finances, that she was disinclined to add to the list. So when the waltz ended and the Flannery brothers took a brief rest and people milled about refilling their cups, Gertrude Merritt crossed the room. He saw her coming. She could tell because his eyes moved to her when she was still several feet away, and there was a brief moment of something in his expression, a kind of quiet alertness, like a man who has been watching a horizon and has noticed something moving on it and is not yet sure what it is. She stopped in front of him and looked up, because he was taller close up than he had appeared from across the room. "You have not asked anyone to dance," she said. He regarded her for a moment. Up close his eyes were a dark greenish-gray, the color of sage after rain, and they were steady in a way that she found both unusual and oddly comfortable. "No," he said, "I have not." "Why not?" Another pause, not the pause of a man searching for an excuse, but the pause of a man being honest with himself before he was honest with her. "Because," he said, "if I asked you to dance, I would not want to stop." The room seemed to go a little quieter around her, though she knew it had not. The Flannery brothers were still talking on the stage, and the cider bowl was still being ladled into cups, and somewhere behind her Nora was laughing at something Thomas had said. None of that had changed. But something had shifted in the immediate space between her and this man, and she was aware of it in the way you are aware of a change in the weather before you can articulate what specifically has altered. "That," she said after a moment, "is the strangest answer I have ever received. It is an honest one. It is also a little presumptuous. You do not know that I would dance with you if you asked." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile but the near relative of one. "No," he said. "I suppose I do not." She looked at him steadily. "I am Gertrude Merritt. My father runs the dry goods store." "I know," he said. "I bought rope there last Tuesday." Your father mentioned he had a daughter who ran the inventory on Fridays and argued with the suppliers on Wednesdays. She laughed despite herself, a short, genuine laugh that surprised her. He says that to everyone, apparently. Ezekiel Collier, he said, and offered his hand. She shook it, which was not the typical way of things at a social, but it felt right, the way certain things feel right because they are true to the nature of the people doing them rather than the expectations of the room around them. You are new to Caldwell Creek, she said. It was not a question. She knew most everyone in town and she had never seen him before. 7 weeks, he said. I took over the Harmon place out on Ridgeline Road, the old homestead that had been sitting empty. She knew the property. Everyone knew the Harmon place. Old Abel Harmon had died 3 winters ago without any family to claim the land, and it had sat vacant since, the fields going to prairie grass and the fence posts leaning at increasingly dramatic angles. The fact that someone had taken it on was news, and the fact that she had not heard about it was unusual, which meant he had not been making himself conspicuous in town. You have been keeping to yourself, she observed. There is a great deal of work to do on that property, he said simply. I have not had much occasion to come into town, but you came to the social. I came to the social, and yet you did not dance. He looked at her with those steady sage-colored eyes and said nothing, because he had already given her his answer, and he was apparently not the kind of man who repeated himself unnecessarily. She thought about it for a moment. The Flannery brothers had picked up their fiddles again, and the opening notes of a reel drifted across the room. Ezekiel Collier, she said, I am going to ask you something and I want you to answer honestly. I generally do, he said. If I were to ask you to dance right now, would you say yes? He set down his untouched cup of cider on the windowsill beside him, and he turned to face her fully, and something in the way he did it, unhurried and deliberate and completely certain, made her heart do something unexpected in her chest. Yes, he said, I would. She extended her hand. He took it. And they walked out onto the floor together, while the Flannery brothers played something that was not quite a waltz and not quite a reel, but somewhere warm and steady between the two. And Gertrude Merritt discovered, in the first 4 bars of that music, that Ezekiel Collier danced the way he did everything else, with quiet precision and complete attention, as though there was nothing in the room that mattered more than the person in front of him. They danced for the rest of the evening. She had known from the first dance that he was different. Not strange, not peculiar, but different in the way that a piece of well-made furniture is different from a piece that is merely functional, in ways that only become apparent the longer you look. He did not try to impress her. He did not tell stories that were slightly too large or laugh slightly too loudly or find small ways to demonstrate his own importance. All the things that men did at socials, usually without being aware they were doing them. He simply talked to her and listened when she talked, and when the music gave them room for conversation, he asked her questions that suggested he had been paying attention to her answers. He asked about the store, and when she explained the inventory system she had devised, a reorganization of her father's original layout based on turnover rate rather than category, he did not nod politely in the way men nodded when women described their competencies, that particular nod that meant they had heard the words but not absorbed the content. He said, "That makes sense. You would want your fastest-moving items accessible from the door," and she had looked at him with undisguised surprise and said, "Exactly." He asked about her mother, carefully, after she mentioned in passing that her mother had taught her to sew the dress she was wearing. He asked in the way a person asks when they genuinely want to know and are also aware that the subject may carry weight, and she told him a little, not everything but enough, and he listened without trying to fix anything or offer comfort that was not needed. He simply received what she said and held it respectfully, and that, she realized, was rarer than it should have been. In return, she learned things about him. He was from Missouri originally, from a farming family outside of Springfield. He had spent 6 years working as a drover on the cattle drives up through Indian Territory and into Kansas. which explained the weather in his face and the way he moved, the economy of a man accustomed to long days, and the particular kind of alertness that came from spending months in open country, where things could go wrong quickly. He had saved enough money to buy a piece of land, and he had chosen the Harmon place because the soil in that part of the county was good and the price was reasonable, and he was 30 years old, he said, and it was time to stop moving. 30 years old is not so very old, she said. No, he agreed. But it is old enough to know what you are doing when you move. She understood what he meant, she thought. He was not talking about age precisely, but about intention, about the difference between drifting and choosing. She had been watching her father drift for 10 years, buoyed along by the current of other people's decisions and her own attempts to compensate for the gaps his exhaustion created. And she thought sometimes that drifting was the most dangerous thing a person could do because it felt so much like simply living. They danced until the Flannery brothers finally put down their fiddles at 11 o'clock, and the lanterns were turned low, and people began pulling on their coats and saying their good nights. Nora found Gertrude near the door with the expression of someone who had been watching something interesting happen from a middle distance all evening and was now ready to discuss it extensively. "Who," Nora said, "is that?" "Ezekiel Collier," Gertrude said. "He took over the Harmon place." "He has been here 7 weeks and I have never seen him," Nora said. "He has been working. Apparently not too hard to come to a social and dance with you for 3 hours. We danced," Gertrude said mildly. "It was a social. That is what one does at a social." Nora gave her the look she reserved for statements she considered technically accurate and fundamentally dishonest. "You danced with him," she said, "more than you danced with anyone else, and you are standing here by the door instead of helping Mrs. Flannery collect the punch bowls, which you always do, which means you are waiting for something." Gertrude opened her mouth to disagree and then closed it again, because Nora was right on all counts and arguing would have been a waste of both their time. Ezekiel came to find her before she finished thinking of a response. He had collected her shawl from the bench where she had left it and held it out to her, and she took it with a thank you and wrapped it around her shoulders. "I will walk you home," he said, "if you will allow it." "My father's store is 2 blocks away," she said. "I have been walking it alone since I was 14. "I know," he said, "but it is a pleasant evening and I would like the extra time." She considered him. He was not asking because he thought she needed protection or because he felt obligated. He was asking because he wanted to talk to her for 2 more blocks, which was, she decided, one of the more honest reasons a man had ever offered for anything. "All right," she said. The October air outside was cold and clear, the kind of Kansas cold that smelled like turned earth and distant wood smoke, and the sky was enormous overhead, as it always was on the plains, the stars thick and bright in a way that never stopped feeling slightly overwhelming even when you had grown up under them. Their boots were quiet on the packed dirt of the street, and Caldwell Creek at night was almost peaceful, the saloon at the far end of Main Street still lit and audible, but at a sufficient distance that it was atmosphere rather than intrusion. They talked the whole 2 blocks and then stood in front of the dry goods store for another 20 minutes talking more, and Gertrude was aware of the cold and also completely indifferent to it, because conversation with Ezekiel Collier had a quality that made the surrounding conditions largely irrelevant. He was funny in an understated way, the kind of funny that revealed itself through a precisely chosen word or a small observation, and he was smart in a manner that had nothing to do with education and everything to do with having paid close attention to his life. He told her about the first morning he had woken up on the Harmon place as its owner, how he had stood on the porch in the gray pre-dawn and looked out at the fields gone to grass, and the fence lines leaning and the barn with its one door hanging crooked on its hinge, and how he had felt something he could only describe as grateful, which had surprised him, because the honest view of the place at that moment was that it was a great deal of work and nothing else. "Grateful for what?" she asked. "For the fact that it needed me," he said. Everything I had worked with before belonged to someone else and needed me to be useful to them. This needed me to be myself. That is a different thing. She thought about that for a long moment. Yes, she said quietly, it is. He looked at her with the steady, attending expression she was already coming to recognize. You understand that, he said. It was not a question. The store needs my father, she said, but my father needs me to keep it going. I am not sure those are the same as being needed for myself. She was not certain why she had said that to him. She had not said it to anyone, not even Nora, because it had the quality of something that might sound like resentment if heard incorrectly, and she did not resent her father. She loved him, and she understood that grief made people smaller versions of themselves, and that her father had been made very small by the loss of her mother. But the truth of what she had said was real, and it sat in her sometimes like a stone she had been carrying so long she had stopped being aware of the weight. Ezekiel did not tell her she was wrong or try to reframe it as something more comfortable. He said, that sounds like a heavy way to spend your days, and the simplicity of it was somehow more generous than all the comfortable reassurances she had declined to accept from herself. She looked up at the sky for a moment, then at him. I should go in, she said. My father will have waited up. He worries about you, Ezekiel said, not as a criticism but as a simple statement of fact. He does. She hesitated on the step, then turned. I am glad you came to the social, Ezekiel Collier. So am I, he said. She went inside. Her father was indeed awake in the back room, sitting with a lamp and an accounts ledger that he had not been reading, and when she came in he looked at her with the particular expression of a parent who has been waiting but is pretending not to have been. You look well, he said. I danced, she said. It was a social. Who did you dance with? She hung her shawl on the hook by the door. A man named Ezekiel Collier. He took over the Harmon place on Ridgeline Road. Harold Merritt turned this over slowly. I know the name. He bought rope last week. Quiet fellow. He is quiet, she agreed. He is also very good. Harold looked at her more carefully. She was not the kind of woman who used that particular adjective loosely, and they both knew it. Good, he repeated. Good, she confirmed, and went to bed, and lay in the dark for longer than she usually did before sleeping, thinking about sage-colored eyes and the way a man could make the word honestly sound like the most natural thing in the world. She saw him 3 days later on Monday morning, when he came into the store for supplies. She was behind the counter reorganizing the bulk goods while her father handled the cash drawer, and she heard the bell over the door and looked up, and there was Ezekiel Collier with a list in his hand, and that quality about him of a man who knows exactly what he needs and is here for precisely that purpose. He bought flour, salt, dried beans, a length of wire fencing, a new hinge for a barn door, and a small bag of tobacco. He and Harold talked briefly about the Harmon land, and Harold mentioned, with a sideways glance at Gertrude, that she knew most of the neighboring homesteaders and could probably tell him who to talk to about the best prices for winter hay, at which point Ezekiel looked at her directly and said, Is that so? My father is being transparent, she said. I appreciate that in a man, Ezekiel said. Harold looked very pleased with himself and found a reason to go into the back room. Gertrude set down the bolt of calico she had been holding and came to the end of the counter. The Haverford farm 2 miles east of you would be your best option for hay, she said. George Haverford is fair-priced and his hay is well dried. Do not go to Jennings over on Creek Road, he waters his bales. Thank you, Ezekiel said. He was watching her with that attending expression, and she was aware of him the way she had been aware of him at the social, as a kind of focused warmth in the room, a particular quality of presence. How is the work going? She asked. It was a genuine question. The south fence is done, he said. The barn door is remedied as of this morning, or will be when I install this hinge. The porch boards are next. He paused. It is coming along. You work fast. I work long, he corrected mildly. There is a difference. She found herself smiling. I suppose there is. He collected his purchases and paid Harold, who had returned from the back room with suspicious promptness, and as he turned to go he paused and looked back at her. "There is a fall market in Wichita on the 22nd, he said. "I have business there. If you had business of your own that day, or simply wanted the company for the ride, I would welcome it." She looked at him. He had asked her directly, without circling around it, without pretending it was purely practical. And there was something about the straightforward nature of the offer that she appreciated in a way she could not have entirely articulated. "I could look at fabric suppliers while we are there," she said. "The store does need new bolt goods." "Then I will come by at 7 on the 22nd, he said. He left. Harold Merritt came to stand beside his daughter at the counter with the expression of a man who had just witnessed something he found quietly delightful. "He is a good man," Harold said. "You spoke to him for 5 minutes, Gertrude said." "Some men you can tell in 5 minutes, Harold said, with the serene confidence of someone who believed he knew something. Gertrude went back to her bolt goods, but she was smiling at them in a way they had never previously provoked. The next week and a half was ordinary in its surface events, and entirely different underneath from every previous week and a half of her life, which she recognized as a slightly absurd thing to think, but thought it anyway because it was true. She went about her usual routine, opening the store in the morning, managing the inventory, arguing with suppliers, cooking supper for her father in the small living quarters behind the shop. But there was a new quality to the ordinary, a kind of forward-leaning energy that the days had not had before, as though the 22nd was a horizon she was walking toward with intention. She also heard more about Ezekiel Collier, because small towns were what they were. George Haverford mentioned that he had sold hay to the new man on the Harmon place, and that he was a straight dealer and a hard worker, and had mentioned he used to drive cattle up through the nations, which George considered a mark of character, because only capable men survived those drives without getting killed or quitting. Old Mrs. Pendleton, who seemed to receive information about new arrivals by some mechanism that science had not yet explained, reported that he attended Sunday service at the Methodist Church and had sat quietly in the back and put $1 in the collection plate, which Mrs. Pendleton considered appropriate and well judged. Nora told Gertrude with great relish that Thomas Reeves had spoken with him at the livery and found him real steady, the kind of steady you do not find in men that young very often, which Thomas had apparently said as though 30 were particularly young. None of it surprised her. It all confirmed what she had already understood about him in the way you understand certain things not gradually, but all at once, in a single evening, across a social hall floor. On the 22nd she was ready at 6:50, which she considered perfectly reasonable and her father considered hilarious, because she was not typically a woman who was ready 10 minutes early for anything. Ezekiel arrived precisely at 7 with a wagon that he had brought into shape with the same methodical care he apparently applied to everything on the Harmon place, the boards tight and clean, the horses, a matched pair of bays, well fed and well tended. The ride to Wichita took most of the morning. It was a good morning for it, cold but bright, the prairie wide open around them, and the sky that particular shade of October blue that only existed in Kansas, saturated and enormous, and so clear it almost hurt to look at directly. They talked the whole way, easily, the conversation moving between the practical and the personal the way good conversation does when two people are genuinely interested in each other, and are not pretending to be something other than what they are. He told her about the cattle drives, about the particular geography of Indian Territory, the red earth and the river crossings, and the way the light fell differently there than it did on the Kansas plains. He told her about the men he had worked with, not with sentimentality, but with the honest appreciation of someone who had relied on others and had been relied upon in return. He spoke of the Cheyenne and Arapaho people whose land the drives crossed with a directness that she appreciated, acknowledging without softening that the whole business of moving cattle across that land was tangled up in a history of injustice, that the men doing the driving had been content not to examine too carefully, himself included, and that he had thought more about it in the years since than he had while he was doing it. She told him about her mother, more than she had told him at the social. She told him about the last year of her illness and how Gertrude had managed the store during those months because her father had been too diminished by fear to think practically, and how she had been 16 and doing accounts in the evenings after spending all day on her feet, and how she had not minded precisely, because being useful had been the only way she knew to manage grief. But how there had also been something taken from her in that time, some ordinary girlhood thing, some permission to be uncertain and young and not the person holding everything together, and she did not quite know what to do with the awareness of that now. He listened to all of it. And then he said very quietly, "You have been holding things together for a long time." "Someone had to," she said. "Yes," he said, "but it should not always have to be you." She looked at the horizon for a moment, the flat brown and gold of the late harvest prairie, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. The Wichita market was large and busy, and full of the particular energy of commerce and the autumn season. Traders and farmers and merchants from across the county all converged on the same collection of stalls and storefronts. She found her fabric supplier and negotiated a good price on 3 bolts of winter woolens and 2 of cotton percale, and she was brisk and confident about it in the way she always was with business, knowing exactly what she needed and what she was willing to pay and being entirely comfortable with the process. Ezekiel, who was selling 2 of his horses and looking at a new harrow, met up with her at midday and they ate lunch at a small counter establishment near the market center, sitting side by side on stools with bowls of beef stew, and it felt remarkably natural, the way things feel natural when they have been shaped by 2 people who are honestly themselves in each other's presence. He sold the horses well, got a fair price for the harrow, and was in visibly good spirits on the ride home, not expansive or loud about it, but quietly satisfied in the way of a man who has done a day's work and done it right. They watched the sunset from the wagon seat, the sky going orange and purple, and then the deep cold blue of dusk, and the stars beginning their appearance one by one over the eastern edge of the world. And Gertrude thought that this was one of the better days she had had in recent memory, which covered a lot of ground because recent memory had had some genuine competition. He said about 10 miles from Caldwell Creek, in the full dark now with the lantern swinging at the side of the wagon, "I would like to call on you properly, with your father's knowledge." She looked at him in the lantern light. He had his eyes on the road ahead, giving her time to consider rather than watching for her answer, which she thought was exactly the right way to ask. "He already knows you call at the store," she said. "Calling at the store to buy rope and calling with intention are different things," he said. "Your father knows the difference, and I would rather be honest about it. What is the intention?" She asked, not because she did not have a reasonable idea, but because she wanted to hear him say it. He looked at her then, brief and steady. "To know you better," he said. "As much of you as you are willing to let me know, and eventually, when the time is right, to say more than that." She held his gaze for a moment. The horses walked on, patient and rhythmic. "You may call on me," she said. "On Sunday afternoons. My father takes a rest after dinner, and there is a parlor with a reasonable fire." "Sunday afternoons," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way she had come to look for. "And Ezekiel," she said, "I will tell you the same thing you told me at the social. I want an honest answer. Always," he said. "Do you mean what you say when you say it?" He did not pause or qualify it. "Yes," he said. "I have learned that nothing else is worth the time." She settled back on the wagon seat and looked at the stars, and she thought that she was quite possibly, for the first time in a considerable while, doing something entirely for herself rather than for the store or her father or the maintenance of the life she had built out of obligation and love and the sheer practical necessity of not falling apart. It was a remarkable feeling. It was not unlike the feeling of the first good frost, cold and clean and clarifying. He came on Sunday. He came the Sunday after that. He came every Sunday for the rest of October and through November, and by the time December arrived and the plains were iron-hard and the sky the color of old pewter, those Sunday afternoons had become the best part of her week in a way that she no longer bothered pretending they were not. They talked about everything. Books, which she had more of than he did, and which she lent him and which he read during the week with the same thorough attention he applied to everything, returning them with observations that were more perceptive than those of anyone else she had discussed them with. They talked about the future of the county, about the railroad that was coming and what it would mean for the cattle trade and for small merchants like her father. They talked about faith and doubt, about what you believed when the world had been hard to you, and about the particular kind of hope that had nothing to do with certainty and everything to do with choosing to act as though things were worth caring about. He told her more about the drives, about a man he had ridden with for 3 years named Calvin Bright, who had died in a river crossing in the Nations, who had been the best hand he had ever known, and whose loss had sat in him like a cold shadow for a long time after. She listened with the same care with which he had listened to her own griefs, receiving what he offered without trying to remedy it, and she felt him relax in a way that suggested he did not speak of Calvin often, and that being able to speak of him mattered. She watched him with her father and found that what she saw there made her love him more than she had expected to, because some men were kind to fathers in a performative way, demonstrating the quality for the benefit of the daughter, but Ezekiel was kind to Harold in the same direct and uncalculated way he was kind to everyone, with genuine interest and without condescension. He asked Harold about the early days of the store, about what Caldwell Creek had been like in the 70s when the cattle drives were at their height, and Harold lit up talking about it in a way he had not lit up in years, and sometimes Gertrude sat in the corner of the parlor listening to the two of them talk, and felt something in the room that was very close to warmth spreading outward from the center of her chest. She also began to worry more about the Holt loan. The problem had been building since summer. Cyrus Holt was calling in smaller merchants' debts across the county, using the leverage of borrowed money to pressure landowners and business operators into sales. 3 farms east of town had already transferred to the Holt Land and Cattle Company in the last 6 months, and 2 weeks before Christmas, a man named Darby who ran the feed mill had sold out and left, and the general opinion in Caldwell Creek was that he had not entirely wanted to, but that Holt's lawyers had made the alternative sufficiently unpleasant that leaving had seemed easier. The loan Harold had taken was for $200, which was not an enormous sum, but was sufficient to cause damage if called in at the wrong time, and the interest terms, which Gertrude had read carefully and unhappily after the fact, were structured in a way that suggested Cyrus Holt's lawyers had intended them to eventually become difficult to maintain. She told Ezekiel about it one Sunday afternoon in December, when the wind outside was doing something violent to the bare trees, and the parlor fire was the best thing in the world. She told him all of it, the terms of the loan, her estimate of how long they could manage the payments at the current rate of business, the pattern of Holt's behavior across the county. He listened with his arms resting on his knees and his eyes on the fire, and when she finished he said, "How much of the loan principal is still outstanding?" $140, she said. "We have paid $60 over the past year." He was quiet for a moment. "I have money set aside," he said. "From the drives and the horse sale. I could—" "No," she said quickly and firmly. "That is your money for the land, for the farm." "Gertrude, no," she said again and looked at him directly. "I am telling you because I trust you and because I needed to say it out loud to someone other than myself. I am not telling you because I need you to rescue it. I will find another way." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was complicated in ways she could not entirely read, a mixture of respect and something else, something that was more tender than she was quite prepared for. "All right," he said quietly. "Then tell me what you are thinking." She had been thinking about approaching the Caldwell Creek Farmers and Merchants Bank, about refinancing the loan at a better rate. The bank's president, a man named Arthur Callow, was not warm to the Holt Company's expansion and had said so publicly on more than one occasion, which made him a potentially sympathetic ear. She had been drafting a proposal in her head for 2 weeks, numbers and terms, and a revised repayment schedule that demonstrated the store's sustainability. She laid it all out for Ezekiel, not to ask his opinion, but because thinking aloud to someone who was listening was a clarifying process. He asked 3 questions, all of them useful, 2 of which pointed toward weaknesses in her proposal that she had already identified and one of which she had not thought of, and she took note of all 3 and was grateful. "You should go to Callow before January," he said. "Holt will move his position in the new year, I would guess. He always moves in winter when he thinks people are less likely to push back." "How do you know that about Holt?" "I heard his name on the drives years ago. He was buying cattle range by the same method in Texas in the mid-70s. He is patient, but he has a pattern." She absorbed this. "That is useful to know. I can come with you if you want, to the bank. Not to speak for you," he added immediately, "but so you are not walking in alone." She thought about refusing on the basis of independence and decided that independence and stubbornness were not the same thing. Having someone in the room whose presence said, without words, that she was not isolated was not the same as needing someone to speak for her. It was simply not being alone, which was different. "Yes," she said. "Come." They went to the bank on the 23rd of December, 3 days before Christmas. Arthur Callow received them in his office, a small, precise man with wire spectacles and the very tidy desk of someone who believed order was a form of integrity. Gertrude presented her proposal with clarity and confidence, the numbers laid out in the ledger she brought with her, the repayment schedule documented, the reasoning for refinancing stated plainly. She was not asking for charity, she told Callow. She was asking for a fair rate on a loan that had been structured to disadvantage her father, and she was demonstrating the store's capacity to service it. Callow listened without interrupting, which she took as a good sign. He asked several questions, made some notes, and looked at Ezekiel once briefly, and then spent the rest of the meeting looking at Gertrude, which was how it should have been. At the end he said he would need a week to review the numbers, but that the proposal was sound and that he was, in general, interested in keeping local businesses out of the hands of Cyrus Holt. "Not out of charity," Callow said. "Holt's consolidation is bad for the town. Keeping diversity in the commercial landscape is good banking." "I understand," Gertrude said. "I am asking for good banking, nothing more." Callow nodded with a small smile. They shook hands and left. On the street outside, in the cold December air, Ezekiel looked at her and said, "That was impressive." "It was practical," she said. "Those are not mutually exclusive," he said, and she laughed, and the sound of it went up into the cold air and disappeared, and she felt unreasonably happy standing on the main street of Caldwell Creek at 2 in the afternoon 3 days before Christmas. He asked her, that afternoon, walking back toward the store, if she would spend Christmas Day with him at the farm. He had been invited to have dinner with the Haverford family but had declined, preferring something quieter, and he wanted to cook, he said, which surprised her because she had not thought of him as someone who cooked. "I learned on the drives," he said. "You either learn to cook or you eat someone else's cooking for 6 months at a stretch. And I found that not everything people put over a fire is food in any meaningful sense." She told him she would ask her father, and her father said yes so quickly that it was obvious he had been hoping for exactly this kind of development. And so, on Christmas Day, Gertrude and Harold Merritt drove out to the Harmon place in the morning light with a jar of preserved plums and a loaf of bread she had baked the day before. The Harmon place had been transformed. Not yet into the prosperous farm it would eventually become, but into something that spoke clearly of intention and care. The fences were straight and tight. The barn stood solid with its new hinge visible, the door swinging clean. The porch boards were sound and even, and the house itself was clean and neat inside, simply furnished but with the particular quality of a space that had been made honest rather than just made presentable. Ezekiel cooked a meal that would have embarrassed most people who had a kitchen and the time to use it properly. A roast with root vegetables and a dried apple pie that was better than the one Gertrude had brought from town. Harold ate 3 helpings and talked more than he had talked at a single stretch in years, and afterward they sat by the fire and Ezekiel played a harmonica badly but enthusiastically at Harold's request. And Harold told stories about Caldwell Creek in the early days that Gertrude had heard before and loved regardless. She looked across the room at Ezekiel at one point, while he was laughing at something Harold said, and she thought with a clear and steady certainty that she was in love with him. Not falling toward it, not approaching it cautiously from the outside, but already fully in it in the way that you sometimes realize you have been somewhere for a while before you noticed you had arrived. She did not say it that day. She held it, warm and certain, and watched him with her father and listened to the wind outside doing nothing that could touch them in here, and was content with what she knew. Arthur Callow called on the store on the 2nd day of January with his decision, which was yes. He would refinance the loan at 4%, down from the 9% that Holt's terms had specified, and the repayment schedule would be extended to give the store room to breathe. Gertrude shook his hand and thanked him with the particular quality of gratitude that is composed mostly of relief, and after he left, she sat down in the chair behind the counter and pressed her hands flat on the wood and breathed. Her father found her there a few minutes later. He sat on the stool across from her and looked at her with the complicated love of a man who was aware of his own failures without having yet figured out how to rectify them entirely. "You did this," he said. "I put a proposal together," she said. "The store did the rest by being viable." "Gertrude," he said. She looked at him. "I know I have asked too much of you," he said. "I know the years since your mother left have not been what they should have been for you. You should have been freer. You should not have had to be the one carrying this." She felt her eyes sting, which annoyed her slightly because she was not generally a crying sort of person. "You loved her," she said. "Grief makes people who they are not for a time, I know that." "You are very generous to me," he said, "more than I deserve." "You are my father," she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That young man." "Collier, yes," she said. "He is good for you. I think so too." Harold nodded, and there was something in it that was both a letting go and a handing over, the particular quality of a man who was finally, after a long time, allowing himself to believe that things might actually be all right. January in Caldwell Creek was long and cold and gray, and Ezekiel still came on Sundays, and on Sundays the world was markedly more interesting than it was on other days. He had taken to bringing things, small things, a piece of firewood for the parlor, a rabbit he had snared and cleaned, a jar of the apple preserves he had put up in the fall, and these were not the elaborate gifts of courtship, but the practical, personal offerings of someone who was thinking of you during the week and bringing evidence of it, which she found more affecting than flowers would have been. In late January, on a Sunday when the cold had finally relaxed slightly, and the light through the parlor window had that particular quality of very early promise, the first hint that February was not forever, he said to her, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, "I want to say more than I said in October." She looked at him. He had both her hands, which had happened gradually during the conversation without either of them having made a deliberate production of it. "You said when the time was right," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think it is right." She waited. "I love you," he said. In the same direct, unhurried way he said everything, without ornamentation or anxiety, as though it were simply the truth and he was reporting it to her because she had a right to know. "I have for some time. I did not want to say it before it was fair to say it, before you had had the time to know me well enough that the words meant something real rather than something hoped." She looked at him for a long moment, this man with his sage-colored eyes and his honest face and his careful hands, and his particular quality of being entirely what he was, and she thought that she had known for 6 weeks that this was coming and had been waiting for it in the way you wait for something you are completely certain about and simply want to experience arriving. "Ezekiel," she said, "I love you too. I have been waiting for you to have the courage to say it." The corner of his mouth moved, and then the whole of his expression moved, and it was the first time she had seen him smile fully and without restraint, and it changed his face in a way that she thought was the most beautiful thing she had seen in a very long time. He leaned forward and kissed her, gently and deliberately, and with the same quality of full attention that he brought to everything. And outside the parlor window the January light was pale and promising, and Gertrude Merritt held onto his hands and thought that whatever came next, she was not going to be carrying it alone. February brought a storm, which was not unusual, and also brought Cyrus Holt, which was more alarming. He came into the store on a Wednesday afternoon with his lawyer, a man named Gerber who had the particular quality of practiced pleasantness over an entirely unpleasant core. Holt was 60, broad, with gray side whiskers, and the bearing of a man accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around his arrival. He was polite in the manner of men who use politeness as a tool. He had heard, he said to Harold, that Harold had refinanced the loan through Callow's bank. He was simply dropping by to express his good wishes and to mention, in the most cordial possible terms, that should the store ever find itself in difficulty, his own company's resources remained available. Gertrude was behind the counter and she watched him deliver this speech and understood every word it was actually saying, which had nothing to do with good wishes and everything to do with letting Harold know that he was still in Holt's field of vision. "Thank you, Mr. Holt," she said, before her father could respond. "We appreciate the courtesy. The store is doing well and we are settled with the bank. I do not anticipate a need for additional financing." Holt looked at her with the evaluating expression of a man who has just been responded to by someone he had not expected to speak. "Miss Merritt," he said, "you run the accounts, do you?" "I run the store," she said. A brief silence. Then Holt smiled, the kind of smile that conceded a point without acknowledging it as a point, and made his farewells, and he and Gerber departed. Harold let out a slow breath. "That man," he said. "Yes," Gertrude said. "Keep everything in order. He is looking for a weakness and he will not find one if we do not have one." She told Ezekiel about it the following Sunday, and his jaw tightened slightly, which was more visible agitation than she had seen from him on any subject. He asked the particulars, listened carefully, and then said, "He may also move against other properties in the area." Haverford mentioned last week that he had received a letter from Holt's lawyers about a disputed boundary on his south field. "Haverford should talk to Callow," Gertrude said immediately. "I told him that." "Good." She paused. "Is your land secure, your title, clear and recorded at the county office?" he said. "I made sure of that before the purchase was complete." A pause. "Holt does not have a claim on me." "What about the note you bought the place on? Was there any debt assumed?" "I paid cash," he said. "Every dollar," she exhaled. "Good, you are safe then." He looked at her steadily. "I am more concerned about you. I am managing." "You are always managing," he said, quietly and without criticism, and she heard in it the echo of what he had said in October, that it should not always have to be her, and she thought that being loved by this man was the strangest and most specific and most entirely welcome experience of her adult life. Spring came to the Kansas plains with its usual mixture of beauty and violence, the weather turning warm in fits and starts, the ground thawing and the prairie grass beginning its annual riot of green, and with it came the energy of new season, the renewed sense of possibility that even the most experienced settler felt when winter finally released its grip on the land. On the Harmon place, which Ezekiel had quietly begun calling Collier Farm because he said it was time to give it its own name, the fields were being prepared for planting, and Gertrude drove out on a Saturday in April to see it for the first time in its working state. He showed her the south field, already broken and turned, dark soil holding the particular promise of turned earth in spring, and the kitchen garden he had begun behind the house, and the improvements to the barn, and she walked all of it with him in the clear April morning and felt the quality of the place, its steadiness, its potential, the sense of a thing that was being made with intention and patience and pride. "It is remarkable," she said, meaning it entirely. "It is getting there," he said. He had stopped beside her and was looking at the field, and then he turned and looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, or rather had seen in pieces and was now seeing whole, an expression of complete decision. He took both her hands. "Gertrude," he said. She looked up at him. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to ask you to be my wife if you are willing and to build this with me. Not because you need looking after, because you do not. And not because I need someone to run a household, but because I want to spend my life with you. Because everything is better with you in it, and I do not wish to keep having everything better on Sundays only." She thought about how long she had been waiting for a thing she had not been fully certain she was allowed to want. She thought about 16, and accounts by lamplight and carrying and managing, and her father's tired eyes and her mother's absence, and the dry goods store and Cyrus Holt, and all the weight of it. And she thought about this man who had stood at the edge of a social hall and refused to dance until she had asked him why, and he had given her the truest and strangest and most right answer she had ever been given. She thought about Sunday afternoons and firelight and the way he held her hands and the way the world felt different when he was in it. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Ezekiel, I will marry you." He brought her to him and held her, and she pressed her face against the warmth of his shoulder and breathed. And the April wind moved over the turned earth of Collier Farm, and somewhere a meadowlark was singing, because it was Kansas in spring, and that was what meadowlarks did, and everything, for this particular moment, was exactly as it should be. They married in June, at the Methodist church where Ezekiel had been quietly attending Sunday services for 8 months, in a ceremony that was simple and honest and exactly right for both of them. Nora Whitfield stood up with Gertrude and wept openly, which she had been doing periodically since the engagement was announced, and showed no signs of stopping. Thomas Reeves, who was by this point Nora's official suitor, and well on his own road toward a similar church and a similar ceremony, stood with Ezekiel. Harold Merritt sat in the front pew with the expression of a man who had been given back something he had been afraid he had irreparably damaged, and he wept too, quietly, and did not seem embarrassed by it. Gertrude wore a dress she had made herself, cream cotton with blue ribbon trim, simpler than a wedding dress was supposed to be and more beautiful for it. And when she walked down the aisle and saw Ezekiel standing at the front with his face so open and so certain, she did not shake or hesitate or feel any of the doubt that she had heard women describe. She felt instead a sense of arrival, of having walked a long road and come to its right end, and she walked toward him steadily and took his hand, and said the words that needed to be said with her eyes open and her voice clear. The reception was held in the town hall, the same building where the harvest social had taken place, and the Flannery brothers played again, and Gertrude danced with her husband for the first time as his wife and thought about what he had said that October night, that if he asked her to dance he would not want to stop, and she thought that the whole of their life together was going to have exactly that quality, a thing too good to want to end. She moved to Collier Farm. This had been their arrangement, practical and agreed upon between them, with Harold's full blessing and involvement. Harold kept the store, with Gertrude coming in on Wednesdays to manage the accounts and suppliers, which suited everyone. The arrangement recognized both that Gertrude's competence was essential to the store's health, and that her life was now centered at the farm, and it did not feel like a compromise because it had been arrived at honestly, and without anyone pretending that things were other than they were. Living at Collier Farm was different from anything she had done before, and she loved it with a fierceness that surprised even her. The space of it, the quiet of early mornings with the mist over the fields and the horses in the paddock and the smell of wood smoke from the kitchen stove, was something she had not known she had been hungry for until she had it. She had spent her whole life in the 2 rooms behind the dry goods store, in a life that was useful and loved and suffocating in ways she had only half admitted to herself. And the farm opened around her like a room without walls, and she breathed into it. She learned things. She had always been practical, but she learned the particular practicalities of farm life, the rhythms of planting and tending, and the reading of weather, and the management of animals. And she learned them with the same thorough attention she brought to the store's inventory, not romantically but honestly, understanding the difficulty and the satisfaction of it together. She was useful in ways that were different from the usefulness of the store, and she found that different forms of usefulness were genuinely restorative rather than merely exhausting. And she had Ezekiel. She had the dailiness of him, the particular texture of a life shared rather than a life visited, and she discovered that this was better than the visits had been, not because the visits had been insufficient, but because completeness has a different quality than approach, and she had been approaching him for months and now they were complete. He worked hard, but he knew how to stop working, which she had not been sure she had expected. He knew how to sit on the porch in the evening with her, and watch the sky change and not be thinking about the next task. He knew how to laugh at supper and talk long past when they should have gone to bed, and wake up the next morning showing no regret about the missed sleep. He was attentive in the dailiness of things, noticing when she was tired or worried without requiring her to announce it, and responding not with fussing, but with a shifted shoulder to carry something or a cup of coffee that appeared at her elbow when she had not asked for one, small evidence of being known. Summer moved into fall, and fall carried with it a harvest that vindicated everything Ezekiel had put into the south field, the wheat coming in strong and good, better than the county average. And when he stood in the field on the day of the harvest with the golden light of September on it, and that look on his face of a man who has bet himself against something and won, Gertrude stood beside him and felt something very close to joy on his behalf. A particular kind of happiness that you can only have for someone else. The Cyrus Holt situation resolved itself that fall in a way that Gertrude found instructive about the nature of men who believed they could simply purchase the world. Callow had been quietly working with several other county merchants and landowners to document Holt's predatory loan practices, and in October the matter came before the county judge in a civil proceeding that received more attention than most civil proceedings in Caldwell Creek, the courtroom packed with people who had opinions about Cyrus Holt and were content to share them from the gallery. Gertrude was not a plaintiff in the proceeding, but she contributed a written account of her father's loan terms to the record, and Haverford testified about the boundary dispute. The judge ruled against Holt on 2 counts and ordered a review of all his county loan instruments. Holt left Caldwell Creek within the month, retreating to whatever other county he was going to systematically consume, and the general feeling in town was one of relief mixed with the wary awareness that there were always more Cyrus Holts in the world, and that what had worked here was people refusing to be isolated from one another, standing collectively against a thing that required isolation to succeed. Gertrude thought about that for a long time. The particular toxin of Holt's approach had always been the way it cut people off from one another, the individual debts held in private, each person believing their situation was their own problem rather than a pattern. What had defeated it was, ultimately, just people talking to one another and finding the pattern. She had known, on some level, that this was what community was for, but the year had made it very concrete. She told Ezekiel this one evening and he said, "Yes, that is also what marriage is for, I think. Making sure someone knows the pattern when you cannot see it yourself." She looked at him across the supper table. "That is quite philosophical for a man who has been moving fence posts all day." "Moving fence posts gives you time to think," he said, and she laughed, and the evening lamp made the kitchen warm, and she thought that all of this was what she had been waiting for without knowing the shape of it. In the 2nd year of their marriage, their first child arrived. He came early one January morning when the world outside was white and still, and Ezekiel, who had been quietly terrified for the last 2 months, spent the entire labor in the outer room alternating between pretending to be calm and completely failing to pretend to be calm. And when the sound came that meant the child had arrived, he was through the door before anyone had called him, and Gertrude, exhausted and triumphant, looked up at him from the bed with the small red-faced person in her arms and said, "A son." Ezekiel sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and his face did something Gertrude had never seen it do before, something entirely unguarded and luminous, and he reached out one careful finger and the baby wrapped his whole fist around it, and Ezekiel let out a long, unsteady breath that had everything in it. "What shall we call him?" Gertrude asked. He thought for a moment. "Harold," he said, "if you agree." She looked at him, startled. Her father's name. "Your father gave me the thing I love most in the world," Ezekiel said simply. "It seems right." She cried then, which she had not done through the entire labor, and did not apologize for it. Harold Merritt, upon being informed that his grandson bore his name, could not speak for a full minute, and then sat down abruptly in the chair by the store counter, and then recovered himself and was utterly incapable of talking about anything else for the next several weeks. Young Harold was a serious baby who became an interested toddler, and the farm suited him as it suited his parents, in the specific way that certain people in certain places are matched to each other's qualities. He had Ezekiel's steady watchfulness and Gertrude's curiosity, a combination that was, as Nora Whitfield observed, either going to produce a person of remarkable capability or a person of remarkable trouble, and possibly both. Nora and Thomas Reeves were married in the fall of 1884, a little more than 2 years after the harvest social, and Gertrude stood up with Nora as Nora had stood with her, and the Flannery brothers played again, and Caldwell Creek had the specific satisfaction of a town that had watched 2 of its good people find their way to good outcomes. The store continued. Gertrude came on Wednesdays and did the accounts and argued with suppliers, and Harold Merritt was steadier now, energized by his grandson and by the relief of the Holt situation, and by the renewed sense that his life was not simply something being managed by his daughter, but something he had agency within again. He began courting a widow named Mrs. Paulson, who had come to Caldwell Creek from Wichita and who ran the millinery shop, and Gertrude watched this development with pure and uncomplicated happiness, because her father deserved warmth in his remaining years, and Mrs. Paulson was a sensible and good-humored woman who appeared to find Harold's slightly melancholy dignity charming rather than burdensome. Harold and Margaret Paulson married quietly in 1886 at the same Methodist church, with Gertrude and Ezekiel and young Harold, now 4 and already with opinions about the proceedings, in attendance. It was a small ceremony and a glad one, and Gertrude held her husband's hand through it and squeezed once, and he squeezed back, understanding everything she meant by it. Collier Farm grew. The wheat was good most years, and Ezekiel added corn in the 3rd year and potatoes in the 4th, and the land responded to his careful attention, the way land does when someone understands that it needs to be worked with, and not merely against. He hired a hand named Jimmy Walsh in 1885, a young man of 19 who had come up from Texas looking for work, and who had the pleasant, open quality of someone who had not yet been taught to be suspicious of good fortune. Jimmy lived in the small room off the barn and ate supper with them most evenings and became, over the years, a fixture of the farm the way certain people become fixtures of places they arrive in by circumstance but stay in by fit. Gertrude's 2nd child arrived in 1886, a girl this time, who came into the world with the same purposeful energy her mother had always brought to everything, announcing herself immediately and at length. They named her Clara, after Ezekiel's mother, and Clara from the beginning was different from Harold in every way. Where he was quiet and watchful, she was loud and immediate. Where he examined things, she simply grabbed them. And she was adored by everyone on the farm with the particular helpless affection that demanding and cheerful small people inspire. Harold, at 4, took his role as older brother with deep seriousness, appointing himself Clara's primary protector and explainer, which she accepted tolerantly and on her own schedule. Watching them, Gertrude sometimes caught herself in the middle of an ordinary task, hanging laundry or kneading bread or sorting the winter root vegetables, stopped by the completeness of what she had, the full, specific weight of a life that was actually, genuinely good. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, she and Ezekiel sat on the porch in the warmer months or by the kitchen fire in winter, and they talked or were quiet in equal measure. And both things were comfortable because they had learned each other's silences as well as their words, and knew which kind of quiet was the good kind and which needed attending to. He still read the book she gave him. She had taken to keeping a small personal journal, something she had not done since girlhood, recording not events precisely but the quality of days, the particular light of a given evening, something Harold had said that made her laugh, the way Ezekiel had looked at her across the kitchen table, and the precise nature of what she had felt in response. One evening in the fall of 1887, sitting on the porch with the children long asleep and the October air carrying the first serious cold of the coming season, Ezekiel said, "Do you remember the social?" She looked at him. "Of course. You walked across the room," he said. "I watched you the whole way and I thought there is someone who is not going to accept a non-answer." "I was not going to," she agreed. "I had been watching the dancing all evening," he said. "I wanted to ask you to dance the moment you walked in. I saw you come through the door and I thought, no. If I go to that woman and start something, I am not going to want it to end. And I was afraid of that." He was quiet for a moment. "I had not been afraid of much before, but I was afraid of that." She looked at his profile in the October dark, the familiar lines of him, the jaw and the brow that had been shaped by years of looking at distances, and she thought about how fear was the most honest emotion because it always told you exactly what you valued. "I am glad you did not ask," she said. He looked at her. "Because then I asked you why," she said, "and you told me the truth, and if you had simply come over and asked me to dance like everyone else, we would have been like everyone else, and we are not like everyone else." He reached over and took her hand, which he had done thousands of times by now, and it still had the same particular quality of the first time he had taken it on the dance floor, the sense of something beginning that did not wish to end. "No," he said, "we are not." They sat in the quiet of the October evening, and from inside the house came the small sounds of sleeping children. And on the horizon the last of the day's light was going out in bands of orange and purple over the flat Kansas plain, and the first stars were appearing, and somewhere down the road the coyotes were beginning their evening conversations, and Gertrude Merritt, who was also Gertrude Collier and had been for 5 years, thought that this was what she would carry all her life as the thing most essentially true about herself. Not that she had managed and endured and held things together, though she had done all of those things and would continue to do them, but that she had walked across a room at a harvest social in 1882 toward a man she did not know and asked him a question, and the answer had been the truest thing she had ever been told, and she had not stopped dancing since. The years after that had their own textures and seasons. The winter of 1888 was the hardest Kansas had seen in a decade, the kind of cold that settled into the bones of the land and did not leave for months, and the farm and the store both weathered it with the practical preparations that Ezekiel and Gertrude had been making since October. Jimmy Walsh, who had by now been with them for 3 years, proved indispensable in keeping the livestock through the worst weeks, and Gertrude cooked enormous amounts of food and kept the house warm with a kind of focused determination that her children would later describe as their mother's particular superpower, the ability to make the inside of things safe regardless of what the outside was doing. Harold Merritt, now in his late 50s, weathered the winter in the apartment above the dry goods store with Margaret, who had transformed the space from the tired rooms Gertrude remembered into something genuinely comfortable. and who sent regular packages of preserved goods out to the farm because she was that kind of woman. Gertrude received them with genuine gratitude and a growing affection for her stepmother that was partly its own thing, and partly the love she felt for anyone who made her father happy. The spring of 1889 was the Kansas land rush year, which changed everything around them. Oklahoma Territory opened to settlement in April, and a considerable portion of the population appeared to develop an urgent desire to be somewhere else. Some families they had known for years left for the rush, and the character of the county shifted slightly, as it did whenever large numbers of people moved all at once. Caldwell Creek itself was not dramatically depleted, but it was altered, and the cattle trail that had been the original purpose of the town's existence was by now mostly historical, the railroads having made the long drives largely unnecessary, and the town was feeling its way toward a different identity. Gertrude thought this was not necessarily bad, and said so at a meeting of the Caldwell Creek Merchants Association, which she had begun attending regularly, and which had begun listening to her regularly, which was a development that some of the older members had needed time to adjust to, but which had become entirely unremarkable by 1889. She argued for diversifying what the town offered, for focusing on the needs of the established farming community rather than the transient cattle trade, for investing in the school and the library collection that old Mrs. Pendleton was trying to establish in the back of the town hall. She was not always agreed with, but she was always heard, which was, in her experience, the most you could ask of any room. Jimmy Walsh got married in 1889 to a woman named Sarah from the congregation, and it was a good match, and Jimmy and Sarah set up in a house at the edge of the Collier farm property that Ezekiel helped them build over the course of 2 weeks in the late summer, along with George Haverford and Thomas Reeves and 3 other neighbors, because that was how you built things in a farming community, with your neighbors' hands and your own gratitude. Harold Jr. started school that fall, and took to it with the same thoroughness he brought to everything, coming home full of information and questions and opinions about his classmates that were more perceptive than most adults' opinions about each other. Clara, now 3, complained about being left behind every single morning, with a persistence that suggested she was going to be an early reader if only to have something to do with herself while her brother was away. And Gertrude, at 30 years old, which was the age Ezekiel had been when he had taken over the Harmon place and decided to stop moving, found that she was exactly where she wanted to be, which was not a small thing to be able to say in any century, but was particularly not a small thing to be able to say in Kansas in 1889. When the world was changing at a speed that made stillness feel almost impossible, and when being a woman who ran a farm and a store and a family, and still showed up to argue at merchant meetings, was a thing some people found puzzling, and she found simply necessary. She was pregnant again by winter, and this one she felt differently from the first 2, a kind of settled certainty about it, as though her body had become practiced in this particular miracle and knew how to go about it. She told Ezekiel on a January evening, and he put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her forehead and held her for a long moment in the kitchen with the fire going and the wind outside reminding them of the Kansas winter's ongoing character. 3, he said. 3, she confirmed. The farm is going to need a bigger table, he said. The farm is going to need a lot of things, she said. It always does. And it always has them, he said, because of you. She shook her head. Because of us, she said. That is the entire point. He smiled, the full open smile that she had first seen in the parlor when she had told him she loved him too, and it had not diminished with repetition, the way some people's smiles become routine. It had, if anything, deepened, taken on the quality of something that had been tested and remained true. Their 3rd child, another son, arrived in the August heat of 1890, and they named him Calvin, after the man Ezekiel had ridden with on the drives and spoken of with such careful grief. And it was a right name and a good name, and Ezekiel carried it without heaviness, as a tribute rather than a wound, which she thought meant that the grief had finished doing what grief eventually does when you are honest about it and let it take its time. Calvin Collier was a sunny, easy child, very different from his older siblings, not curious like Harold or forceful like Clara, but simply joyful in a way that seemed to come from some basic disposition toward contentment. He laughed easily and ate enthusiastically, and slept well, and was adored by everyone with the particular ease that naturally contented people inspire. Harold Merritt met his third grandchild in September, arriving at the farm with Margaret and a great deal of opinion about the child's fine appearance, and he held Calvin for a long time with the expression of a man who had been given more in his late years than he had expected, and who was fully aware of what an unearned gift this was, and who intended to honor it. He was slower in those years, her father. Not ill precisely, but the long accumulation of hard decades was visible in him, in the way it becomes visible in men when they finally stop running from it. Margaret was good to him, attentive without being managing, and the millinery shop kept her busy and him involved in small ways that were good for both of them. Gertrude watched him with the complicated, tender love of a daughter who has been, in some ways, her father's parent, and is only now permitted to simply be his child, and she did not hold any of the hard years against him. She had not held them against him in the moment, and she held them even less now, because what was the point of carrying a stone when you were finally allowed to put it down? The new decade settled over Caldwell Creek with a feeling of consolidation. The town was smaller than its cattle trail peak but steadier, the people in it more rooted, the permanence of the community more evident in the buildings that were going up in brick rather than the wood-frame structures of the first frantic decade. The school expanded. The library collection grew. The Merchants' Association, with Gertrude's regular involvement, established a mutual insurance arrangement for its members that was, in essence, the same lesson learned from the Holt situation made into a permanent structure, people not being isolated from one another, and therefore being less vulnerable. Ezekiel was elected to the county commission in 1891, which surprised him and did not surprise Gertrude at all. He served with the same quality he brought to everything, without ambition for the position itself, but with thorough attention to the work it involved, and people trusted him in the way people trust someone who is not doing something for reasons other than the thing itself. On an October evening, a Tuesday in 1892, exactly 10 years after the harvest social, Gertrude was standing on the porch of Collier Farm in the last of the day's light. The children were inside, Harold now 10, and doing his schoolwork at the kitchen table, Clara 8 and arguing with him about something, Calvin 2, and investigating the kitchen in a manner that required supervision. Ezekiel had come up from the field and was washing at the pump, and he caught sight of her standing there and straightened up and looked at her across the yard in the October light. She held his gaze. He was 39 years old and weathered by a decade of Kansas seasons and strong and present, and looking at her with the expression she had first seen across the floor of a harvest social and had not stopped seeing since, the expression of complete attention, as though nothing in the world was more worth attending to. He crossed the yard and came up onto the porch and stood beside her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She thought about it for a moment. About the distance she had walked across that social hall floor 10 years ago, about the question she had asked and the answer she had received, about everything that had come from that answer, the farm and the children and the life that was nothing like what she had been able to imagine from behind a dry goods counter at 23, and was entirely what she would have wanted if she had been able to imagine it. "I was thinking," she said, "that I am glad I asked." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood watching the October sun go down over Collier Farm the way they had stood on many evenings and would stand on many more, the two of them solid and warm and together in the particular way of people who have built something real and know it, the prairie wide around them, the stars beginning again, the children's voices a constant bright noise behind the door, and everything, exactly as it should be. Inside, Harold called that supper was ready, which meant he had appointed himself responsible for announcing it, and Clara told him he was not the mother, and young Calvin made the sound he made when he was ready to be held, and Gertrude and Ezekiel Collier looked at each other in the way they had been looking at each other for 10 years, with complete acknowledgement of everything they knew and everything they were, and they went inside together to their family and their life, and they did not stop.